Mason. Well, here in the studio is the Conservative MP and former Deutsche Bank executive Sajid Javid. And joining us from Dartmouth, New Hampshire is David Blanchflower, a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. First of all, let's just deal with tomorrow morning's front pages. And we've just heard that Mervyn King is saying tomorrow morning in the front pages that Britain is in the grip of the worst ever financial crisis. This is heavy stuff, and it's heavier than 2008 in terms of that kind of language.
Kirsty, in 2008, I was running a trading floor and it was bad, and this is starting to feel possibly as bad. This is a global crisis, and that's what Mervyn King is getting at. The euro could collapse. Interbank lending has dried up in Europe over the last few days. We could have defaults.
And we've got flatlining growth.
Well, the whole world has flatlining growth.
But at a time like this, is it important that the Governor of the Bank of England and the Chancellor sing out the same hymn sheet? Now, you know, the Governor of the Bank of England said very clearly today, and a rebuff to George Osborne, it is absolutely not up to the Bank of England to decide where assets should be spent and what assets to invest in. Do you agree with Mervyn King?
No, that's not a rebuff at all. That's the Governor of the Bank of England actually stating what Bank of England policy has always been. He's referring to QE. He's not referring to credit easing, if that's what you're getting at. He's referring, when QE takes place, the Bank of England will put that money into the accounts of banks, and those banks will decide exactly how that money is spent and how they lend that money onwards. That's the key thing.
But 18 months after the first huge tranche of quantitative easing, we're back in the same place as before. Why?
We're not at all. I mean, what you've missed there is that we have a government in place now that recognised that we had a debt problem, and you don't get out of a debt problem by borrowing more. That's a big change.
David Blanchflower, you don't get out of a debt problem by borrowing more. He's right, isn't he?
Well, you have a growth problem. Actually, that's where we are. The government was out of the current Tories, if you like, were out of office for 13 years, been in government for 17 months, and they still haven't got a growth plan. The problem that we actually have is that we have no plan for growth. The economy is flatlining, and actually the big event that happened, in fact, this week was that the ONS downgraded growth. So the Bank of England thought the past was much better than it was. Turns out it was mistaken. So actually things were much worse in the past. It makes it clear that this was absolutely not the time to be cutting public spending in the same way as this government has done. And now I have an absolute sense that the government's in a state of panic. It doesn't know what to do because these growth data are really bad. And it can't just blame what's happening on the rest of the world. It's because fiscal policy is in disarray.
Fiscal policy is acting against monetary policy, isn't it? That's the problem.
No, that's absolutely not the case. And I'll explain
the
why. Because the government has put into a plan, which is people have referred to as planning, which is to deal with the debt and to deal with the deficit. If we can't get that under control, then really we're not going to build the confidence we need in the economy. In fact, what the government has done has given the space for the Bank of England to take this kind of monetary action. Without the government creating that space, it would have been harder for the Bank of England to take this action today.
But actually, we had to revise growth downwards, which would suggest that the severity of the cuts is acting against any improvement in growth at all.
Okay, that can't possibly be the case. But actually, in the first year of this government, the cuts haven't even started. So how could those cuts that haven't happened actually had an impact?
So, David Blanchflower, does that indicate that it's going to kick in next year rather than this year?
Well, I don't agree with that. I mean, what actually happened, if you recall, was the government, George Osborne and David Cameron, actually said things like, this economy is bankrupt, it's like Greece and Portugal. And what's happened since they started to say that was absolutely not true. Consumer confidence and business confidence has collapsed based upon what they said. The expectations of what's caused this collapse to come. And so the data looks really very bad. If you look at the collapse in consumer confidence, it looks very much like what happened in 2008. And then that's all before the cuts really come. And what we've seen is a collapse of consumer confidence. And if you listen, businesses are really worried. The business groups are all talking about the government has to turn. And what's happened is the government just says, we have a great debt plan, it's everybody else's fault. It doesn't really look like it knows what it's doing.
I mean, you're saying the big cuts are coming next year, and that is absolutely true. But we've already had £6 billion worth of cuts. What David Blanchflower is saying as well is, you know, the consumers are terrified.
In the first fiscal year of this government, we haven't had any real-term cuts. That includes the $6 billion happened, but overall, there haven't been any real-term cuts. But what's more important is this, and this is the key point, because what Mr. Blanchflower seems to be suggesting is that the government should be borrowing more and spending that money. His knowledge comes from the world of academia. My knowledge comes from the real world.
So the Monetary Policy Committee that he sat on is just academia, is it?
No, I'm talking about his knowledge. He's, he's stuck in his ivory tower. He's read a lot of books. He reads a lot of research papers.
No, not true.
I spent 20 years on a trading floor, and let me make it very clear. It is not possible for any government in the world to force investors to buy their bonds. Investors have a choice. And if we want proof of that, we can look at Greece, we can look at Portugal, we can look at Italy.
So you're saying you absolutely guarantee that this government is not going to ease the level of cuts to reduce the deficit? Are you saying that's not going to happen no matter whether or not we go absolutely flatlining?
Of course, I can't issue an absolute guarantee, just like no one can, because a lot depends on what happens on the global economy. What I can say for certain is that this government is absolutely right to recognise that when you're in a debt crisis, you don't deal with that by borrowing more, and that's absolutely key.
David Blanchflower.
Well, it's very interesting that a young gentleman who's had no experience whatsoever in making any macro policy decisions, had no policy experience at all. I sat at the Bank of England through 2009 and watched this, the economy starting to collapse in 2008, and it looks very like what's happened then. The logic has to be, in a crisis, monetary policy and fiscal policy have to be working together. Headwinds come. What we have right now is the bank. Would you let me finish, please? Yeah. Would you mind letting me finish? Headwinds come to the economy. Monetary policy is trying to catch up, and the government is doing exactly the wrong thing. Just think about what they did when they came in, when the economy was growing. They said, we have to keep this plan going. Now the economy is collapsing. Now the world economy is collapsing, and we have a euro debt crisis. Yeah, what do they say? They say the same treatment we had a year ago. Let me finish. The same treatment we had a year ago applies now. It's nonsense. Of course it doesn't. What we need to do, just as they're doing in the United States, is to have a fiscal plan for jobs, try and stimulate the economy, put money into the infrastructure, and cut payroll taxes.
Well,
Yes, I mean,
well, first of all, actually, what they're doing in the United States is cutting spending as well. So actually, what they're doing there is what we're doing here, and so that's what we should focus on.
Thank you both very much indeed.